the ancient administration, and Illumination. The year of the French Transformation, 1789, marks the starting of a new period of progressive alter in Europe and the conclusion of the ancient administration of absolutist government, at slightest in France. But the house of the ancient arrange in France had centrality distant past French borders for numerous reasons. In the 18th century, France was the most capable nation on the landmass, the most crowded and one of the most affluent. French culture was appreciated and imitated by the upper classes all through Europe, and French was the dialect of the nobility and illustrious courts all over the landmass. Counting in Russia, the royal residence of France's Lord Louis XIV are 1643 to 1715. Built at Versailles in the 17th century, symbolized the magnificence, riches, and control of supreme government, and rulers in other nations modeled their possessed royal residences after it. Since the French monarchy's impact over the landmass, its drop in 1789 sent stun waves over Europe. So, it is vital to get the nature of the ancient administration in France and the variables that driven to its destruction. The ancient administration in France, Europe in the 18th century was composed nearly totally of outright governments, nations run by a lord or ruler who acquired his or her position and would pass the crown to the eldest child or girl. These rulers knew few restrictions on their control and claimed to run the show on the premise of divine right as God's specialists on soil. Britain was to some degree of in special case to this run the show, as the brilliant transformation of 1688-14 Chapter 1 concluded a long battle between Parliament and the Stuart Lords and basically supplanted the outright government, protected government, in which laws constrained the monarch's powers, point one, in most of the rest of Europe. All through the larger part of the 17th and 18th centuries, the powers of the European rulers really expanded as effective rulers slowly broke. The control of primitive rulers, centralized control, and made bound together more cutting-edge states. In France, Louis XIV went through much of his rule reinforcing control of the government and centralizing political specialists in Paris, or more popular representation of ruler, Louis XIV, the Sun King, 1701. By regard, portraying control and ceremony of a supreme ruler. Copyright AAC/Topham, The Picture Works. The ancient administration and the Illumination 15 precisely, and his wonderful royal residence built at Versailles, 10 miles south of Paris. Versailles was implied both to reflect the greatness of Louis, the Sun King, and to encourage his centralizing approach. In the past, the rulers of France and their regal courts had traveled broadly in the kingdom, going by the regal spaces and the common chateaus of capable nobles. Louis XIV ruled from Versailles, and those nobles who looked for regal favor had to live at Versailles for much of the year. Versailles, at that point, got to be the image both of control of the ruler and of France itself. The impact and centrality of this was not misplaced on other European rulers. Russians are Dwindle the Incredible and Prussian Lord Frederick the Awesome both built royal residences modeled on Versailles. Ancient administration in France. The term ancient administration, or ancien regime, was presented by the progressives of 1789. It was based on inflexible social progression in which one's put in society was decided generally by birth, not by difficult work or ability. The organization of society was clarified by the extraordinary chain of being, a concept predominant since medieval times, which held that the whole world was organized progressively, from God and the blessed messengers at the beat to lifeless objects, such as rocks at the foot, with human creatures existing someplace in between. At the best of the human chain stood the ruler, God's divine agent, communicated strikingly in the 1766 decree of Louis XV, R. 1715 to 1774, sovereign control dwells in my individual alone. It is for me alone that my arrangements take their presence and their specialist. It is to me alone that administrative control has a place, without reliance or division. All open arrange exude from me. To Louis XV's great-grandfather, the Sun Lord, put a small more essentially when he broadcasted, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state." Underneath the Lord, the rest of French society was organized into three classes, or domains, each with particular social obligation, and each progressively organized. But to begin with domain, the clergy, delighted in their tall status by ideals of their otherworldly work and nearness to God, in spite of the fact that the clergy comprised less than 1% of the populace. The moment domain, the respectability or privilege given military back for the ruler and constituted between 1 and 2% of the populace. The respectability was really very a changed bunch. The wealthiest and most effective nobles, numbering as it were a few hundred families and known as les grands, possessed expansive landholdings and rich chateaux, and worked out significant political impact as councils of state and neighborhood judges. More various and less lifted up were the common nobles, seigneurs, who claimed bequests, frequently with numerous laborers working their lands beneath different courses of action. There were 2 nobles who had few belonging and lived in proper destitution, holding their titles in exceptionally small else. 16 Chapter 1 the third bequest. The remaining 97% of the populace comprised everybody else and was dependable for the generation of products and arrangement of administrations. France, like all of Europe at the time, was overwhelmingly a rustic society. The lower class made up around 85% of the populace, and in this manner the colossal bulk of the third bequest. Compared to other European nations, the French lower class was generally affluent. Indeed so, less than 40% claimed their claim arrived. Most French laborers leased their arrive from proprietors, either as occupant agriculturists or sharecroppers. The ancient administration economy was, in this manner, overwhelmingly rustic and rural, and ruled by subsistence cultivating, with laborers creating scarcely sufficient to meet their claim needs. Any overflow generation was retained by lease, tithes, seigneurial levy, paid to the ruler of the bequest, and charges. In the late 18th century, there was not one or the other national money, nor a uniform framework of weights and measures, nor indeed a genuinely national advertise. A great organized and illustrious interstates existed, but it still took its slightest 5 days to travel by coach from Paris to Marseilles, approximately 8 hours by car nowadays. Nearby this conventional agrarian segment, in the 17th and 18th centuries, commercial exchange was extending, empowered by illustrious arrangement. Since the 17th century, financial arrangement was guided by mercantilist hypothesis, which held that the riches of a country seemed best be improved by the collection of valuable metals like silver and gold. Nations that did not have local stores of such metals, like France, had to depend on exchange to obtain them. The government empowered the improvement of fabricating businesses to give merchandise for the worldwide advertise, and France created a worldwide notoriety for creating extravagant products such as silk, glossy silk, bind, fragrances, and embroidered works of art. The advancement of fabricating and exchange driven to the development of a modern social lesson, the bourgeoisie, or the center course, and to the expansion of numerous little dealers and business people, called the petite bourgeoisie, closed the conclusion of the 18th century. The hypothesis of mercantilism, with accentuation on valuable metals and government control, came beneath challenge both by elective financial speculations, such as Adam Smith's hypothesis of a free showcase economy, see underneath, and by the bourgeoisie themselves. Ancient administration France was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and Catholicism played a critical part in the nation, both as a religion and as an institution. Religion was unavoidable in day-by-day life, and devout administrations and celebrations were the most vital occasions in most towns and towns. Those who gone to school were instructed by clerics, and those without work depended on the church for charity. The church was moreover a capable institution politically and was closely interlaced with the government. French rulers, as divine rulers, were delegated in the cathedral at the ancient administration and the Illumination 17 reams, and the Lord named all religious administrators and other tall authorities of the church. The church possessed broad property, maybe 10% of all the arrive in France, and the earnings from these properties were colossal, some of the time rise to half the yearly salary of the regal government. This structure of state and society, depicted here for France, was comparative to that of other European nations in the 18th century. Christian rulers claiming divine right administered all of the major powers. The most vital and effective were France, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, which were characterized by a primitive or semi-feudal and mercantilist financial framework and an inflexibly various leveled social structure. The regal families of the European capitals, joined together by common bonds of religion, culture, and blood, were expectation on protecting the ancient arrange and their positions in it. Since the center of the 17th century, European governments had deliberately sought after approaching the adjusted control a framework of moving universal unions that anticipated any one nation from getting to be as well capable. Wars were battled not so much for belief system or patriotism, but to keep up the adjusted control. Thus, these clashes were generally controlled. The victor did not need to smash the vanquished, as this would disturb the adjust. In any case, the vanquished state might be a future partner. This entirety framework, both household and worldwide, was genuinely challenged at the conclusion of the 18th century and the starting of the 19th, to begin with by the thoughts of the Illumination, at that point by the strength of the French insurgency of 1789, and afterward by the mechanical insurgency and the eminent control of the in-use center lesson. Government, Christianity, the church, chain of command, and mercantilism would all be undermined with termination at the turn of the 19th century. By 1815, a range would be reestablished, but as it were incidentally, the Illumination, the Ancien Regime in France and somewhere else in Europe, was debilitated not as it were by inside issues and pressures, but too by modern ways of considering almost society and the world. Rising in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Illumination was both a development and a set of thoughts. It was too called the Age of Reason, since of its accentuation on control of the human intellect to free the person and make stride society. Edification rationalists contended that information can be inferred as it were from encounter, try, and perception. They energized individuals to utilize their claimed basic thinking, to free their minds from partiality, unexamined specialists, and persecution by the church or the state. The German logician Immanuel Kant composed in 1784 that 18 chapter 1 edification is man's rise from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity, he composed, is the failure to utilize one's claimed understanding without the direction of another. The proverb of the edification, in Kant's words, was subsequently, Sapere aude, have boldness to utilize your possessed understanding. Three of the French edification rationalist Voltaire made a comparable point when he composed, the most valuable books are those to which the perusers themselves contribute half. They create the thought of which the creator has displayed the seed. The result of this offer to reason, science, and self-reliance was, of course, a genuine undermining of the specialists that set up educated the ancient administration, especially the church and the state. The standards of the edification were in a few ways a continuation of revelations and speculations of a logical transformation in the 16th and 17th centuries, when logical perception and test challenged and debilitated the worldview and specialists of the church. In the 16th century, the clean stargazer Nicholas Copernicus proposed a hypothesis of a universe that set the sun, or maybe then the soil, at the center of the sun-powered framework. In the 17th century, the Italian Galileo Galilei built a galactic telescope through which he affirmed Copernicus's heliocentric hypothesis, bringing him into strife with the church's examination for his sin. The English rationalist and mathematician Isaac Newton, in his treatise Principia, 1687, determined the standard of gravity and movement. He depicted the universe as a machine and nature as represented by sound and steady laws. Geologists in France found fossils that clashed with the time plot proposed in the ancient confirmation. All of these men utilized perception and tests to draw conclusions that clashed with the acknowledged intelligence of time. Illumination logicians connected the strategies of the logical insurgency to the ponder of society and a government, or maybe then the fabric universe, accepting that normal laws represented human behavior and educate, fair as they administered the universe. The central herald of the Illumination was the Englishman John Locke, 1632 to 1704, who to begin would broach the idea that reason and information are determined from involvement. Human nature, Locke thought, is basically great, not at all like the scriptural idea of unique sin. And human character is a work of one's environment, childhood, and instruction. It is conceivable at that point, by forming society and environment and giving great instruction, to deliver a way better society. Locke, moreover, contended in his Moment Treatise of Gracious Government, 1690, that man has common and unavoidable rights to life, freedom, and property. He composed that political communities, i.e. governments, are shaped by well-known assent, suggesting a kind of legally binding relationship between individuals and government that flew in confront of the far-reaching idea of divine right. Locke's thoughts, and indeed his dialect, had an entered the ancient administration and the edification 19 miles impact on other Enlightenment-era political scholars. counting Thomas Jefferson over the Atlantic. These thoughts are found afterward in both the U.S. Statement of Freedom and the French Announcement of the Rights of Man. In spite of the fact that the Illumination was a Europe-wide marvel, the development was ruled by French journalists, masterminds, and logicians who were alluded to as philosophes. The noble de Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755, a fault finder of absolutist government, satirized the rule of Louis XIV, as well as first-class society and the church, alluding indeed to the Pope as a conjurer. In his Soul of the Law, 1748, he contended in great illumination mold that laws are inferred from nature. He too created the thought of the division of powers, partitioned the official, authoritative, and legal capacities of government into partitioned institutions. Another concept that was picked up by the Americans and consolidated by James Madison in his plan of the U.S. structure. Another imperative French edification mastermind, the rationalist Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, expounded on a few of Locke's thoughts around characteristic rights and prevalent sway. Man is born free, composed Rousseau, and all over he is shackled. Society debases and mutilates man's characteristic flexibility and correspondence. Rousseau contended, but a transformed society and government can re-establish the adjust through respectful freedom and correspondence, arranged between the individuals and the government through a social contract. Rousseau portrayed this perfect society in his Social Contract, 1762, which, like numerous Illumination distributions, was prohibited in France. The most vital distribution of the French Illumination was a reference book, an exertion to compile a comprehensive and precise collection of information, utilizing the unused gospel of logical observation. Most of the critical scholars of the time contributed to the reference book, which was distributed between 1751 and 1765 in 17 volumes, numbering 16,288 pages. It was basically through the reference book that numerous edification thoughts were dispersed. Those of Locke and Montesquieu, for illustration, showed up beneath sections such as political authority and natural liberty and empower majority rule propensities in France and somewhere else. The co-editor of the reference book, Denis Diderot, was credited with saying that salvation would arrive when the final ruler was choked with the insides of the final priest. The French government twice endeavored to smother the reference book, but distribution continued, and it got to be a best vendor. One more logician must be said, not so much into his effect on French progressive propensities per se, but into his broader effect on the improvement of Europe and the West. The Scottish logician Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790. Smith connected Illumination 20 Chapter 1 Box 1.1, the play that started insurgency. The Marriage of Figaro, 1786, is for the most part known as a delightful comedian musical drama by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. But the musical drama was based on a profoundly fruitful and questionable play composed in 1778 by Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, a man who at different times was performer, squire, lender, negotiator, shipper, mystery operator, distributor, and, one would have to say, an entrepreneur and something of a rebel. Indeed so, Beaumarchais was too a normal edification mental, a part of the respectability who satirized benefit and tall society, and a reformer, but not a progressive. At the time of the American Transformation, he encouraged the French rule of Louis XVI, R. 1774 to 1793, to bolster furtively the progressives against the British and overseen nearly single-handedly to raise cash to buy and transport sufficient military hardware to bolster 25,000 men in the colonies. In between his numerous ventures and enterprises, he overseen to type in a number of plays, counting two whose notorieties have endured for the most part through musical dramas. The Hairstylist of Seville, composed by Rossini, and The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart. In Figaro, the storyline is a comedian endeavor by the title character to disappoint the endeavors of the Czech to work out his droit, du seigneur, the gathered right of the ruler of a house to bed any unused bride and is utilized. But the play, moreover, makes much fun of various teach of the ancient administration, counting social chain of command, acquired benefit, bumbling authorities, censorship, and the courts. When the play was to begin with compose, Louis XVI was so horrified by its audacity that he attested it seemed never be performed. Be that as it may, after a few alterations and modifications, counting exchanging the setting of the play from France to Spain, and various extra surveys by the censors, the play was at last endorsed and performed by the Comédie Française in 1784. In spite of its 4.5 hour length, it was hugely prevalent, ran for 68 progressive exhibitions, and got to be the most noteworthy victory of 18th century theater in France. The progressive pioneer Danton credited Figaro with killing off the nobility, and Napoleon characterized the play as the insurgency as of now in action. Thoughts approximately the characteristic state of things the economy and the advertise, contending that government impedances in the economy abuse the transaction of normal powers of competition and supply and request. In his 900-page creation, The Riches of Countries, Smith examined how self-interest may work for the common great. By giving free curb to person covetousness and the private amassing of riches, the invisible hand of the advertised would advance society in conclusion, a equation some of the time characterized by the apparently dumbfounding axiom, private bad habit yields open virtue. He contended for a framework of laissez-faire, from the French meaning let do, in which the government went without from interferometer in the ancient administration and the edification 21 economy. These thoughts smashed the predominant teachings of protectionism and mercantilism and got to be the premise for what would create into capitalism. It is maybe not totally coincidental that The Riches of Countries showed up in 1776, the same year as the U.S. announcement of freedom. The Illumination is regularly treated as one of the causes of the French transformation of 1789, but it is critical to recognize that it was not the cause of transformation. Most of the philosophes ought to more appropriately be thought of as reformers than progressives. They were for the most part from the upper classes themselves, and in spite of the fact that they satirized and criticized ancient administration society, they for the most part favored the creation of an illuminated or protected government, or maybe then a well-known or agent shape of government. The philosophes themselves did not constitute any political parties or progressive organizations, nor did they propose any exceptionally particular change programs or approaches. None of them was included exceptionally straightforwardly in the progressive occasions of 1789. Indeed so, the thoughts raised by edification masterminds were significantly unsettling and challenging to ancient administration society and political arrange. The philosophes assaulted the exceptionally suspicions on which the ancien regime was built, and they held the existing educate up to mock. Their accentuation on reason and autonomous, considering undermined propensities of day's acquiescence to the specialists of the church and the state. The declarations of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau that the extreme protest of government was to advance the joy and nobility of the person made an entire modern way of considering almost the political world, and not fair in France. The exceptionally truth that these thoughts were being publicized and wrangled about gave rise to a modern phenomenon, public opinion, and the thought of government and legislative issues as something public. Much cross-fertilization of thoughts happened between America and Europe at this time. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, gone by France, studied the works of the philosophes and were much affected by the thoughts of the Illumination. Additionally, the illustrations of the American progressives, the Statement of Autonomy in the U.S. Structure, 1787, motivated both reformers and progressives in France. The effect of the edification when distant past France and America, in any case, influencing essentially each nation in Europe and all levels of society. A few European rulers indeed grasped the edification, or at slightest a few parts of it, and utilized its standards to present changes. These enlightened despots included Frederick the Incredible in Prussia, Catherine the Awesome in Russia, and Maria Theresa in Austria, in Holland and Britain. 22 Chapter 1 liberals inside the political foundation utilized edification thoughts to impact, alter, in Spain and Italy as in France. Knowledge utilized them to criticize and push the ancient administration. Illumination thoughts given motivation for political philosophies developing in the 18th and 19th centuries, from progressivism to communism and communism. The accentuation on reason, experimentation, perception, and observation laid the establishment for cutting-edge social science and the way we think about and get a human society nowadays. But most imperatively, the entire tenet of the edification laid the establishment for human rights, prevalent sway, resistance, and regard for law, values that lie at the center of cutting-edge European society.